102. Caring. June 3rd, 1992. Professor Quirrell was very sick. He'd seemed better for a while, after drinking his unicorn's blood in May, but the air of intense power which had surrounded him afterward hadn't lasted even a day. By the Ides of May, Professor Quirrell's hands had been trembling again, though subtly. The defense professor's medical regimen had been interrupted too early, it seemed. 6 days ago, Professor Quirrell had collapsed at dinner time. Madame Pomfrey had tried to forbid Professor Quirrell from teaching classes, and Professor Quirrell had shouted at her in front of everyone. The defense professor had shouted that he was dying regardless and would use his remaining time as he chose. So Madame Pomfrey, blinking hard, had forbidden the defense professor from doing anything except teaching his classes. She'd asked for a volunteer to help her take Professor Quirrell to a room in the Hogwarts infirmary. More than 100 students had risen to their feet, only half wearing green. The defense professor no longer sat at the head table during mealtimes. He didn't cast spells during lessons. The oldest students who had the most Quirrell points helped him to teach, the seventh years who had already sat their defense and EWTS in May. They took turns floating him from his room in the infirmary to his classes and brought him food at mealtimes. Professor Quirrell proctored his battle magic classes from a chair, sitting. Watching Hermione die had hurt more than this, but that had ended much more quickly. This is the true enemy. Harry had already thought that after Hermione had died. Being forced to watch Professor Quirrell die, day by day, week by week, had not done much to change his mind. This is the true enemy I have to face, Harry thought in Wednesday's defense class, watching Professor Quirrell leaning far to one side of his chair before that day's seventh-year assistant caught him. Everything else is just shadows and distraction. Harry had been turning over Trelawney's prophecy in his mind, wondering if maybe the true Dark Lord had nothing to do with Lord Voldemort at all. Born to those who have thrice defied him, seemed to strongly invoke the Peverell brothers and the three Deathly Hallows, though Harry didn't exactly see how Death could have marked him as an equal, which seemed to imply some sort of deliberate action on Death's part. This alone is the true enemy, Harry thought. After this will come Professor McGonagall, Mum and Dad, even Neville in his time, unless the wound in the world can be healed before then. There was nothing Harry could do. Madame Pomfrey was already doing for Professor Quirrell what magic could do, and magic seemed strictly superior to Muggle techniques when it came to healing. There was nothing Harry could do, nothing he could do, nothing at all. Harry raised his hand and knocked upon the door in case the person there could no longer detect him. "What is it?" came a strained voice from the infirmary room. "It's me." There was a long pause. "Come in," said that voice. Harry slipped inside and closed the door behind him and cast the quieting charm. He stood as far away from Professor Quirrell as he could, just in case his own magic was making the professor feel uncomfortable, though the sense of doom was fading with each passing day. Professor Quirrell was lying back in his infirmary bed, only his head propped up by a pillow. A coverlet of cottony material, red with black stitching, covered him to his chest. A book hovered before his eyes, outlined in a pale glow which also surrounded a black cube lying by the bed. Not the defense professor's own magic, then, but a device of some kind. The book was Thinking Physics by Epstein, the same book Harry had lent to Draco a few months back. Harry had stopped fretting about its possible misuse several weeks earlier. "This," Professor Quirrell said, and coughed. It didn't sound quite right. "This is a fascinating book, if I'd ever realized." A laugh mixed with another cough. "Why did I assume the Muggle arts must not be mine, that they would be of no use to me? Why did I never bother trying to test it experimentally, as you would say, in case my assumption was wrong? It seems sheerly foolish of me, in retrospect." Harry was having more trouble speaking than Professor Quirrell was. Wordlessly, Harry reached into his pocket and laid a kerchief on the floor, which he unfolded to reveal a small white pebble, smooth and round. "What's that?" said the defense professor. It's a transfigured unicorn." Harry had checked the books, had learned that since he was too young to have sexual thoughts, he would be able to approach a unicorn without fear. The same books had said nothing about unicorns being smart. Harry had already noticed that every intelligent magical species was at least partially humanoid, from merfolk to centaurs to giants. from elves to goblins to Vila. All had essentially human-like emotions. Many were known to interbreed with humans. Harry had already reasoned out that magic didn't create new intelligence, but just changed the shape of genetically human beings. Unicorns were equinoid, were not even partially humanoid, didn't talk, used no tools, they were almost certainly just magical horses. If it was right to eat a cow to feed yourself for a day, then it had to be right to drink a unicorn's blood in order to stave off death for weeks. You couldn't have it both ways. So Harry had gone into the forbidden forest wearing his cloak. He had searched the grove of unicorns until he saw her, a proud creature with a pure white coat and violet hair, with 3 blue blotches on her flank. Harry had gone over, and the sapphire eyes had stared at him inquisitively. Harry had tapped out the sequence 123 on the ground several times with his shoes. The unicorn had shown no sign of responding in kind. Harry had reached over, taken her hoof in his hand, and tapped the same sequence with the unicorn's hoof. The unicorn had only looked at him curiously, and something about feeding the unicorn the sleeping potion-laced sugar cubes had still felt like murder. That magic gives their existence a weight of meaning which no mere animal could possess. To slay something innocent to save oneself, that is a very grave sin. Those 2 phrases, from Professor McGonagall, from the Centaur, had both run through Harry's mind, over and over, as the white unicorn had yawned, laid down on the ground, and closed its eyes for what would be the last time. The transfiguration had lasted an hour, and Harry's eyes had watered repeatedly as he worked. The unicorn's death might not have come then, but it would come soon enough, and it was foreign to Harry's nature to try to refuse responsibility of any kind. Harry would just have to hope that, if you didn't kill the unicorn to save yourself, if you did it to help a friend, it would be acceptable in the end. Professor Quirrell's eyebrows had climbed toward his hairline. His voice was less soft, had something of his normal sharpness as he said, "I forbid you from doing that again." "I wondered if you'd say that," Harry said. He swallowed again. "But this unicorn is already doomed, so you might as well take it, Professor. Why have you done this?" If the defense professor really didn't understand that, he was slower on the uptake than anyone Harry had ever met. "I kept thinking there was nothing I could do," Harry said. "I got tired of thinking it." Professor Quirrell closed his eyes. His head leaned back into the pillow. "You were lucky," the defense professor said in a soft voice, "that a unicorn in transfigured form did not set off the Hogwarts wards as a strange creature. I shall have to take this outside the grounds to make use of it, but that can be managed. I shall tell them that I wish to look upon the lake. I will ask you to sustain the transfiguration before you go, and it should last long enough after that. And with my last strength, dispel whatever death alarms were placed to watch over the herd, which, the unicorn being not yet dead, but only transfigured, will not yet have triggered. You were very lucky, Mr. Potter." Harry nodded. He started to speak, then stopped again. Words seemed to stick in his throat once more. "You already calculated the expected utilities if it works, if it goes wrong. You assigned probabilities, you multiplied, and then you threw out the answer and went with your new gut feeling, which was the same. So say it. Do you know," Harry said unsteadily, "of any way at all by which your life might be saved?" The defense professor's eyes opened. "Why do you ask me that, boy?" "There's spell I heard of, a ritual." "Be silent," said the defense professor. An instant later a snake lay in the bed. Even the snake's eyes were dull. It did not rise. Speak on," hissed that snake, its flickering tongue its only motion. There is a ritual I heard of from the schoolmaster by which he thinks the Dark Lord might have lived on. It is called," and Harry stopped, as he realized that he did know how to say the word in Parseltongue. "Horcrux. It requires a death, I have heard. But if you are dying in any case, you might try to adapt the ritual, even at great risk for the new S-spell, SSO, that it can be done with a different S-sacrifice. It would change the whole world if you S-succeed, though I don't know anything about the S-spell. The S-schoolmaster thought it tore off a piece of S-soul, though I don't S-see how that could be true." The snake was hissing laughter, strange, sharp laughter, almost hysterical. "You tell me of that S-spell, me. You must learn more caution in the future, boy, but it matters not. I learned of the Horcrux S-spell since long ago. It is meaningless." "Meaningless," Harry said aloud in surprise. "Would be pointless S-spell from beginning if S-souls existed. Tear piece of S-soul, that is lie. Misdirection to hide true S secret. Only one who does not believe in common lease will re-assen further. SC beneath obscuration, realis how to cast S spell. Required murder is not S sacrificial ritual at all. S sudden death S sometimes make S ghast, if magic bursts and imprints on nearby thing. Horcrux S spell channels death burst through caster, create as your own ghast instead of victim's S, imprints ghast in S special device. S second victim picks up Horcrux device imprints your memoris into them. But only memoris from time Horcrux device was made. USC flaw. The burning sensation was back in Harry's throat. No continuity of, there wasn't a snake word for consciousness. S-self. You would go on thinking after making the Horcrux, then S-self with new memoris dis, and is not rested. Yes, you do SC. Also Merlin's S interdict prevents powerful S spells from passing through S such a device, S since it is not truly alive. Dark wizards who think to return thus are weaker, easily dispatched. None have persisted long by S such means. Personalities change, mix with victims S. Death is not truly gainsaid. Real S-self is lost, as you say, not to my present task. Admit I considered it long ago. A man was lying in the infirmary bed once more. The defense professor breathed, then made a wretched coughing sound. Can you give me a full recipe for the spell? Harry said, after a moment's deliberation. There might be some way to improve on the flaws with enough research, some way to do it ethically and have it work. Like doing the transfer into a clone body with a blank brain instead of an innocent victim, which might also improve the fidelity of the personality transfer. Though that still left the other problems. Professor Quirrell made a short sound under his breath that might have been laughter. You know, boy, Professor Quirrell whispered, I had thought to teach you everything. The seeds of all the secrets I knew, from one living mind to another. So that later, when you found the right books, you would be able to understand. I would have passed on my knowledge to you, my heir. We would have begun as soon as you asked me, but you never asked. Even the grief surrounding by Harry like thick water gave way to that, to the sheer magnitude of the missed opportunity. I was supposed to, I didn't know I was supposed to, another coughing chuckle. Ah yes, the unknowing muggle-born, in heritage if not in blood. That is you, but I thought. Better of it that you should not walk my path. It was not a good path in the end. It's not too late, Professor, Harry said. A part of Harry yelled that he was being selfish, and then another part shouted that down. There would be other people to help. Yes, it is too late, and you shall not persuade me otherwise. I have thought better of it. As I said, I am too full of secrets better left unknown. Look at me. Harry looked almost despite himself. He saw a still unwrinkled face, looking old and pained, beneath a head rapidly losing its hair, even the sides looking wispy now. Harry saw a face he'd always thought was sharp, now revealed as thin, muscle and fat fading away from the face, as from the arms beneath it, like the skeletal form of Bellatrix Black he'd seen in Azkaban. Harry's head wrenched aside, unthinkingly. You see, whispered the professor, I dislike to sound cliched, Mr. Potter, but the truth is, the art's cold dark. Really are not good for a person. In the end, Professor Quirrell breathed in, breathed out. There was quiet for a time in the infirmary, the two of them watched only by the elaborately ornamented stone of the walls. Is there anything left unsaid between us? Said Professor Quirrell. I am not dying today, mind you, not right now, but I do not know how long I shall be able to converse. There's, Harry said, swallowed again. There's a lot of things, way too many things, but it might be the wrong thing to ask. But I don't want this one question unanswered. Snake. A snake lay on the bed. I learned how the killing curse works. Requires true hate to cast, not much hate, but must want target dead, they say. In prison with life eaters, you cast killing curse at guard. Said you did not want him dead, was that lie. Here now at this distance, you may speak truth. Even if you fear it reflects poorly on you, it should not matter now, teacher. I wish to know, must know, will not abandon you either way. A man lay on the bed. Listen carefully, Professor Quirrell whispered. I will tell you a conundrum, a riddle of a dangerous spell. When you know the answer to that puzzle, you will also know the answer to your question. Are you listening? Harry nodded. There is a limitation to the killing curse. To cast it once, in a fight, you must hate enough to want the other dead to cast Avada Kedavra twice. You must hate enough to kill twice, to cut their throat with your own hands, to watch them die. then do it again. Very few can hate enough to kill someone 5 times. They would get bored. The defense professor breathed several times before continuing. But if you look at history, you will find some dark wizards who could cast the killing curse over and over. A 19th century witch who called herself Dark Evangel. The auras called her A.K. McDowell. She could cast the killing curse a dozen times in one fight. Ask yourself, as I ask myself, what is the secret that she knew what is deadlier than hate and flows without limit? A second level to the Avada Kedavra spell, just like with the Patronus charm. I don't really care, Harry answered. The defense professor chuckled wetly. Good, you are learning, so you see. A pause of transformation. I did not wish God dead after all. Cast killing curse, but not with hate. And then a man. Harry swallowed hard. It was both better and worse than what Harry had suspected, and characteristic enough of Professor Quirrell. A cracked soul for certain, but Professor Quirrell had never claimed to be whole. Any else to say, said the man in the bed. Are you absolutely sure, Harry said, that there is nothing you've ever heard of that might save you, Professor, in all your lore? Finding and uniting all 3 Deathly Hallows, an ancient artifact that Merlin sealed behind a riddle nobody's ever figured out. You've seen some of what I can do, that I'm good at solving riddles. You know, I can figure things out sometimes that other wizards can't. Harry's voice broke. I have a strong preference for your life over your death, Professor Quirrell. There was a long pause. One thing, whispered Professor Quirrell. One thing, that might do it, or it might not, but to obtain it is beyond your power or mine. Oh, it was just the setup for a subquest, said Harry's inner critic. All the other parts screamed for that part to shut up. Life didn't work like that. Ancient artifacts could be found, but not in a month, not when you couldn't leave Hogwarts and were still in your first year. Professor Quirrell took in a deep breath, exhaled. I'm sorry, that came out. Too dramatic, do not. Get your hopes up. Mr. Potter, you asked, for anything. No matter how unlikely, there is a certain object, called a snake lay on the bed. The philosopher's S-stone, hissed the snake. If there had been a mass-manufacturable means of safe immortality this entire time and nobody had bothered, Harry was going to snap and kill everyone. I read of it in a book, Harry hissed. Concluded it was obvious myth. No reason why S-same device would provide immortality and endless gold. Not unless S-someone was just inventing happy S-stories. Not to mention, every S-sane person S should have been researching ways to make more S-stoners or kidnapping maker to produce. Thought of you S specifically, teacher. A hissing of cold laughter. Reasoning is wis, but not wis enough. Like with Horcrux S spell, absurdity hides true S secret. True S stone is not what that legend S says. True power is not what S stories claim. S stone's S surpassed maker was not one who made it. One who holds it now was not born to name now asked. Yet S-stone is powerful healing device in truth. Have you heard it S spoken of? Just in the book. One who holds S-stone is repository of much lore, taught S schoolmaster many S secrets. S schoolmaster has S said nothing of S-stone's holder, nothing of S-stone, no hints. Not that I can easily recall, Harry replied honestly. Ah, hissed the snake. Ah, well. Could ask S schoolmaster. No, do not ask him, boy, he would not take question well. But if the S-stone only heals, S-schoolmaster does not believe that, would not believe that. Too many have S-sought S-stone or S-sought holders lore. Do not ask, must not ask. Do not try to obtain S-stone yourself. I forbid. A man lay on the bed once more. I am at my limit, said Professor Quirrell. I must regain my strength before I go to the forest. With your gift, leave now. But sustain the transfiguration before you go. Harry reached out, touched the white pebble lying within the kerchief, renewing the transfiguration on it. It should last for 1 hour and 53 minutes after this, Harry said. Your studies. Do well. It was far longer than Harry's transfigurations had lasted at the start of the school year. Second-year spells came to him easily now, without strain, which wasn't surprising, since he would be 12 in less than 2 months. Harry could even have cast a memory charm, if it had been good for someone to forget every memory involving their left arm. He was climbing the power ladder, slowly, from very far down. The thought came with a potential for sadness, a thought of one door opening as another closed, which Harry also rejected. The door to the infirmary closed behind Harry, as the boy who lived walked swiftly and with purpose, shrugging on his invisibility cloak as he moved. Soon, presumably, Professor Quirrell would call for assistance, and an older student trio would guide the defense professor into some quiet place, maybe the forest, with an excuse of viewing the lake or some such. Some place the defense professor could eat a unicorn undetected after Harry's transfiguration wore off, and then Professor Quirrell would be healthier for a time. His power would return to him as strong as he'd ever been for a much shorter time. It wouldn't last. Harry's fists clenched as he strode, the tension radiating up his arm muscles. If the defense professor's treatment regimen hadn't been interrupted by Harry and the auras that he had brought to Hogwarts, it was stupid to blame himself. Harry knew it was stupid, and somehow his brain was doing it anyway. Like his brain was searching, carefully finding and selecting some way for this to be his fault, no matter how far it had to stretch. As if having things be his fault were the only way that his brain knew how to grieve. A trio of seventh-year Slytherins passed Harry's invisible form in the hallway, heading for the healer's offices, where the professor waited, looking deeply serious and concerned. Was that how other people grieved? Or did they, on some level, not really care, as Professor Quirrell thought? There is a second level to the killing curse. Harry's brain had solved the riddle instantly, in the moment of first hearing it, as though the knowledge had always been inside him, waiting to make itself known. Harry had read once, somewhere, that the opposite of happiness wasn't sadness, but boredom. And the author had gone on to say that to find happiness in life, you asked yourself not what would make you happy, but what would excite you. And by the same reasoning, hatred wasn't the true opposite of love. Even hatred was a kind of respect that you could give to someone's existence. If you cared about someone enough to prefer their dying to their living, it meant you were thinking about them. It had come up much earlier, before the trial, in conversation with Hermione, when she'd said something about magical Britain being prejudiced, with considerable and recent justification. And Harry had thought, but not said, that at least she'd been let into Hogwarts to be spat upon. Not like certain people living in certain countries, who were, it was said, as human as anyone else, who were said to be sapient beings, worth more than any mere unicorn, but who nonetheless wouldn't be allowed to live in Muggle Britain. On that score, at least, no Muggle had the right to look a wizard in the eye. Magical Britain might discriminate against Muggle-borns, but at least it allowed them inside so they could be spat upon in person. What is deadlier than hate and flows without limit? Indifference, Harry whispered aloud, the secret of a spell he would never be able to cast, and kept striding toward the library to read anything he could find, anything at all, about the Philosopher's Stone. 103. Tests. June 4th, 1992. Daphne Greengrass was in the Slytherin common room, writing a letter to her lady mother, who was surprisingly intransigent about power sharing, despite not even being in Hogwarts to exercise control, when she saw Draco Malfoy stagger in through the portrait door carrying what must have been a dozen books, Vincent and Gregory behind him, each carrying a dozen more. The aura who'd accompanied Malfoy stuck his head in briefly, then withdrew to who knew where. Draco looked around, then seemed to be struck by a bright idea as he staggered toward her, Vincent and Gregory following after. "Can you help me read these?" said Draco, sounding slightly out of breath as he approached. What? Lessons were over, only the exams were left now, and since when did Malfoys ask Greengrasses for help with their homework? "These," Draco Malfoy said importantly, "are all the library books Miss Granger borrowed between April 1st and April 16th. I thought I'd go through them in case there are any clues there, only then I thought, maybe you should help because you knew Miss Granger better." Daphne stared at the books. The General read all that in 2 weeks. A twinge of pain went through her heart, but she suppressed it. "Well, I don't know if Miss Granger finished them all," Draco said. He held up a cautioning finger. "In fact, we don't know if she read any of them, or if she really borrowed them, I mean. All we've observed is that the library ledger says she checked them out." Daphne suppressed a groan. Malfoy had been talking like this for weeks. There were some people who clearly were not meant to be involved with mysterious murders because it did strange things to their minds. "Mr. Malfoy, I couldn't read all these if I spent my whole summer doing nothing else." "Then just skim through them, please," Draco said. "Especially if there's, mysterious words scribbled in a handwriting or a bookmark left inside, or I've seen those plays too, Mr. Malfoy." Daphne rolled her eyes. Don't we have auras now for "we're doomed"? Shrieked Millicent Bulstrode as she burst up from the lower chambers into the slithering common room. People paused to look at her. It's Professor Quirrell. A sudden air of attentiveness, as of long-standing disputes about to be settled. Well, finally, someone said, as Millicent tried to catch her breath. He's only got, 10 days left to go bad? 11 days, said the seventh year who was running the betting pool. He's gotten a little better suddenly, and he's going to summon the first years for our defense final by surprise in 50 minutes. A defense final, Pansy said blankly, but Professor Quirrell doesn't give exams. The ministry defense final, shrieked Millicent. But Professor Quirrell doesn't teach anything from the ministry curriculum, objected Pansy. Daphne was already fleeing to her room, racing for the first-year defense textbook that she hadn't touched since September and screaming curses inside her mind. One desk back of her, someone was crying, their soft sobs providing a background chant of despair for the classroom. Daphne looked back, expecting to see a Hufflepuff and hoping it wasn't Hannah, and was surprised at first, though not on further reflection, to see it was a Ravenclaw. Before them were set the exam parchments, turned over, waiting for the bell. 50 minutes hadn't been nearly enough preparation time, but it was something, and Daphne was now feeling ashamed that she hadn't thought to send messengers to warn the Hufflepuff, Ravenclaw, and Gryffindor houses. They'd started giving house points again just 3 days ago, at the beginning of June, but the Auxiliary Protective Special Committee still ought to promote house unity. Another Ravenclaw, sitting 4 desks to her left, also started to cry. That was Catherine Tongue of Dragon Army, if she recalled correctly, whom she'd once seen take on 3 Sunshine soldiers simultaneously without a flinch. Daphne had calmed down after the first couple of minutes of frantic reading. It was just a test, not a murder or anything, and if almost all the first-year students turned in mostly blank parchments, then it stood to reason that nobody would be shamed. But Daphne could understand, if not exactly sympathize, that Ravenclaws and Hufflepuffs might not see it that way. He's evil, another Ravenclaw witch said in a shaking voice. 100% pure dark wizard to the bone. The Dark Lord Grindelwald wouldn't do this, not to children. He's worse than you know who. Daphne looked reflexively at where Professor Quirrell was sitting, slumped to one side but his eyes alert, and she thought she saw the defense professor smile for one tiny instant. No, that had to be her imagination. There was no way the defense professor could have heard that. The bell rang. Daphne flipped the parchment over. The top was stamped with the seals for the ministry, the Hogwarts Board of Governors, and the Department of Magical Education, and runes to detect cheating. Below that was a line for her to write her name, and a list of exam rules with a picture of Lindsay Gagnon, the director of the Department of Magical Education, shaking an admonishing finger at everyone. Halfway down the page was the first exam question. It was, why is it important for children to stay away from strange creatures? There was a stunned pause. One student began laughing. She thought it was from the Gryffindor section of the class. Professor Quirrell made no motion to censor it, and the laughter spread. Nobody spoke aloud, but the students looked around at each other, exchanging glances as the laughter died down, and then, as if by some unspoken agreement, they all looked at Professor Quirrell, who was smiling down at them benevolently. Daphne bent over her exam, wearing a defiant, evil smile that would have done proud to either Godric Gryffindor or Grindelwald, and she wrote down, because my stunning hex, my most ancient blade, and my patronus charm won't work against everything. Harry Potter turned over the last page of his defense exam. Even Harry had needed to quash a small bit of nervousness, some tiny remnant of his childhood, upon reading the first real question. How can you make a shrieking eel be silent? Professor Quirrell's lessons had spent roughly 0 time on the surprising yet useless trivia that some idiot had imagined a defense class should look like. In principle, Harry could have used his time turner to read through the first-year defense book after being notified of the surprise exam, but that might have unfairly skewed the grading curve for others. After staring at the question for a couple of seconds, Harry had written down quieting charm and included the casting directions in case the ministry grader didn't believe that Harry knew it. Once Harry had decided to just answer all the questions correctly, the exam had gone by very quickly. The most realistic answer to more than half the questions was stunning hex, and many of the other questions had optimal solutions along the lines of turn around and walk in the opposite direction, or throw away the cheese and buy a new pair of shoes. The last question on the test was, what would you do if you suspected there might be a bogus snake underneath your bed? The ministry-approved answer, Harry could in fact recall from his read-through of the textbook at the start of the year, was tell your parents. The problem with this had occurred to Harry right away, which was why Harry had remembered it. After some pondering, Harry wrote down, "Dear Ministry Grader, I'm afraid the real answer to that is a secret, but rest assured that a bogus snake would present no more trouble to me than a mountain troll, a dementor, or you-know-who. Please inform your superiors that I find your standard answer prejudicial to Muggle-borns, and that I expect this failing will be corrected at once without any need for my direct intervention. Sincerely, the boy who lived." Harry signed the last parchment with a broad flourish, turned it over into his stack, put down his quill, and sat up. Looking around, Harry saw that Professor Quirrell seemed to be looking in his rough direction, though the defense professor's head had nodded to one side. The other students were still writing. Some of them were silently crying, but they were still writing. Continuing to fight was also a lesson Professor Quirrell had taught. Interminably later, the official exam time was up. A seventh-year student went from desk to desk, collecting the exams in Professor Quirrell's place. The last exam parchment was collected, and Professor Quirrell sat up straight. "My young students," he said softly. The seventh-year student had her wand trained on the defense professor's mouth, so that they all heard his voice seeming to come from right beside them. "I know, that probably seemed very fearsome to some of you. It is a different kind of fear from facing the enemy's wand. You must conquer it separately. So I shall tell you this now. It is the custom of Hogwarts that grades are given in the second week of June. But for my case, they can make an exception, I think." The defense professor smiled his familiar, dry smile, tinged now as though by a suppressed grimace. "I know you are worried, that you were not prepared for this exam, that my lessons have not covered this material, and I quite forgot to mention that it was approaching, though you should have known. It would come in time, but I have just now magically checked the answers you have given on that terribly, terribly important final exam, though of course only the ministry grade is official, and assigned your full year grades taking the results into account, and magically written your full grades down on these parchments." Professor Quirrell tapped a stack of parchments on the side of his desk, "which will now be handed out. An incredible spell, is it not?" A few students on the Ravenclaw side were looking indignant, but for the most part the students just looked relieved, and some Slytherins were chuckling. Harry would have laughed too, if not for the pain of watching Professor Quirrell gasp out the words. The seventh-year student standing beside Professor Quirrell pointed her wand and spoke an incantation in magical pseudo-Latin. The parchments rose up and started to drift through the air, separating in mid-flow to drift toward each student. Harry waited until his parchment had arrived on his desk, and then unfolded it. The parchment said E+, which stood for exceeds expectations. It was the second highest grade letter, the highest being outstanding. In another world, a distant, vanished world, a little boy named Harry would have shouted with indignation about receiving only the second highest grade. This Harry sat quietly and thought. Professor Quirrell was making some point, and it wasn't as though the exact grade letter mattered in any other way. Was Professor Quirrell saying that Harry had done relatively well, but not lived up to his full potential? Or was the grade meant to be read literally, that Harry had in fact exceeded the defense professor's expectations? "All of you, pass," Professor Quirrell said, as the students all looked at their final grades, as sighs of relief rose from desks, and Lavender Brown raised her parchment in a clenched fist held high with triumph. "Every student in first-year battle magic has passed, except for one." A number of students looked up in sudden terror. Harry sat there silently. He had seen the point immediately, and even if it was a wrong point, he knew Professor Quirrell would never, ever be talked out of making it. "All of you in this room have received grades of at least acceptable. Neville Longbottom, who took this test in the Longbottom home, received a grade of outstanding, but the other student who is not here has had a dreadful grade entered on her record for failing the only important test that was given her this year. I would have marked her even lower, but that would have been in poor taste. The room was very quiet, though a number of students were staring angrily at the professor. You may think that a grade of dreadful is not fair, that Miss Granger was faced with a test, for which her lessons had not prepared her, that she was not told that the exam was coming on that day. The defense professor drew in a shaking breath. Such is realism, said Professor Quirrell. The only important test may come at any time. Be better prepared for it than she was. As for the rest of you, those who have received exceeds expectations or above have received my letters of recommendation to certain organizations beyond Britain's shores, where your training might be completed. They will contact you when you are old enough, if you still appear worthy, and if you have not failed an important test. And remember, from this day, you must train yourselves. You cannot rely on future defense professors. Your first year of battle magic is over. You are dismissed. Professor Quirrell sat back with his eyes closed, seeming to ignore the excited babble that broke out around him. In time, most of the students had departed, and one remained, staying a prescribed distance from the defense professor. The defense professor opened his eyes. Harry raised the parchment with its E+, still silent. The defense professor smiled, and it went all the way to those tired eyes. It is the same grade that I received in my own first year. TH. Harry couldn't make the words thank you come out. They were stuck in his suddenly closed throat, the defense professor tilting his head and giving him an inquiring stare. So Harry just bowed jerkily and then left the room. 104. The Truth, PT1, Riddles and Answers. June 13th, 1992. It was the last week of school in Hogwarts, and Professor Quirrell was still alive, barely. The defense professor himself would be in a healer's bed this day, as he'd been for almost the last week. Hogwarts tradition said that exams were given in the first week of June, that exam results were released the second week, and that in the third week there would be the leave-taking feast on Sunday and the Hogwarts Express transporting you to London on Monday. Harry had wondered, a long time ago when he'd first read about that schedule, just what exactly the students did during the rest of the second week of June, since waiting for exam results didn't sound like much, and the answer had surprised him when he'd found out. But now the second week of June was done as well, and it was Saturday. There was nothing left of the year but the leave-taking feast on the 14th and the Hogwarts Express ride on the 15th, and nothing had been answered. Nothing had been resolved. Hermione's killer hadn't been found. Somehow Harry had been thinking that, surely, all the truth would come out by the end of the school year, like that was the end of a mystery novel, and the mystery's answer had been promised him. Certainly, it had to be known by the time the defense professor died. It couldn't be allowed for Professor Quirrell to die without knowing the answer, without everything being neatly resolved. Not exam grades, certainly not death. It was only truth that finished a story. But unless you bought Draco Malfoy's latest theory that Professor Sprout had been assigning and grading less homework around the time of Hermione being framed for attempted murder, thereby proving that Professor Sprout had been spending her time setting it up, the truth remained unfound. And instead, like the world had priorities that were more like other people's way of thinking, the year was going to end with a climactic Quidditch match. In the air above the stadium, distant figures on broomsticks swooped and pirouetted and spun around each other. The red-purplish truncated tetrahedron that was the quaffle was caught, tossed, blocked, and occasionally thrown through floating hoops, accompanied by stadium-rocking cries of triumph or dismay. Blue and green and yellow and red-trimmed robes shouted with the enthusiasm that people felt so easily when no action would be required from them personally. It was the first Quidditch match Harry had attended at Hogwarts, and he'd already decided that it would be the last. "Davies has the quaffle," shouted the amplified voice of Lee Jordan. "That's another 10 points for Ravenclaw in 7, 6, 5. Holy smokes, he's done it already. Smack through the center of the central hoop. I've never seen such a winning streak. I'm calling it right now for Davies becoming captain next year after Borton steps down." Lee's voice cut out abruptly, and Professor McGonagall's own amplified voice said, "That's the Ravenclaw team's own business, Mr. Jordan. Confine yourself to the match, please." And the Slytherins take possession. Flint hands off the quaffle to the lovely Mr. Jordan. To the merely acceptable Sharon Vizcaino, whose hair trails behind her like a comet as she blazes toward the Ravenclaw defense, now with two bludgers in close pursuit. Pusey's on Sharon's tail. What are you doing in Glebby? And she swerves in midair to avoid. Is that the snitch? Go, Cho Chang, go. Higgs is all ready. What are you two doing? Calm down, Mr. Jordan. How am I supposed to calm down? That was the worst missed play I've ever seen. And the snitch is gone, maybe gone for good, after being missed that badly. Pusey's heading off towards the goal posts. Glebby's nowhere near him. In a distant era of history, maybe in another world entirely, Professor Quirrell had undertaken that the House Cup would be awarded to either Slytherin or Ravenclaw, or possibly, somehow, both, for he had promised that 3 wishes would be granted. So far it was looking good on 2 out of 3. If you just went by the current score, Hufflepuff was leading the race for the House Cup by something like 500 points, thanks to Hufflepuff students doing their homework and staying out of trouble. It appeared that Professor Snape had been strategically taking quite a lot of points from Hufflepuffs for, the last 7 years or so. Slytherin House, reigning champion for the last 7 years, still had to its advantage a certain generosity of its head of house in handing out points, and this was sufficient to put it neck and neck with Ravenclaw House, home of the academic achievers. Gryffindor was far behind in the last place, as befit the house of nonconformists. Gryffindor had Slytherin's profile when it came to academics and mischief, only without the advantage of Professor Snape. Even Fred and George had barely broken even on the year. Ravenclaw House and Slytherin House both needed a lot of points from somewhere if either wanted to catch up with Hufflepuff in the next 2 days. And so far as anyone knew, Professor Quirrell hadn't done a single thing leading to the obvious result. It was happening all by itself, now that one lone professor in Hogwarts had taught a class with creative problem-solving. The final Quidditch match of the year was between Ravenclaw and Slytherin. Earlier in the year, Gryffindor's initial Quidditch lead had vanished after their new seeker, Emmett Shear, fell off a possibly malfunctioning broomstick during his second game. This had also required some hasty rescheduling of the remaining games. This, the final game of the year, wouldn't end until the snitch was caught. Quidditch scores added directly onto the house points total. And what did you know? Today it seemed that both the Slytherin and Ravenclaw seekers just could not catch the snitch. The snitch was practically on top of you, you demide dimwit. Language, Mr. Jordan, or I'll remove you from this game. Though it was a terrible play, I admit. Harry had to admit that Lee Jordan and Professor McGonagall had a wonderful comedic routine, with Jordan as the banana man and Professor McGonagall as the straight woman. Harry now felt a little sorry to have missed it at the earlier Quidditch matches. It was a side of Professor McGonagall he hadn't seen before. A few seats down from where Harry sat in the Hufflepuff section of the Quidditch bleachers, there lurked the hulking form of Cedric Diggory. The super Hufflepuff had observed the most recent near-air collision between Cho Chang and Terence Higgs with the keen eye of a wizard who was a seeker and a Quidditch captain in his own right. The Ravenclaw seeker is new, Cedric said, but Higgs is in his 7th year. I've played against him. He's better than that. You think it's a strategy? Asked one of the Hufflepuffs sitting next to Cedric. It would make sense if Slytherin needed some extra points to lead for the Quidditch Cup, Cedric said. But Slytherin already has us beat for the title. What are they thinking? They could have won right there. The game had started at 6:00 in the afternoon. A typical game would have gone until 7 or so, at which point it would have been time for dinner. June in Scotland meant plenty of daylight. Sunset wasn't until 10. It was at 8 p.m. and 6 minutes, according to Harry's watch, when Slytherin had just scored another 10 points, bringing the score to 171-40, when Cedric Diggory leapt out of his seat and shouted, "Those bastards." "Yeah," cried a young boy beside him, leaping to his own feet. "Who do they think they are, scoring points?" "Not that," cried Cedric Diggory. They're trying to steal the cup from us. But we're not in the running anymore for not the Quidditch Cup. The House Cup. The word spread, with cries of outrage. That was Harry's cue. Harry politely asked a Hufflepuff witch sitting next to him, and another Hufflepuff sitting one row above him, if they could move aside. Then Harry drew forth from his pouch a huge scroll, and unfurled it into a 2-meter-tall banner which stuck in place in midair. The enchantment had been done courtesy of a 6th-year Ravenclaw who had a reputation for knowing less about Quidditch than Harry did. In huge, glowing purple letters, the sign read, "Just buy a Clark 2, 6, 47. Beneath it was a snitch, with a blinking red X over it. Second after second after second, the time counter incremented. As that counter rose higher, there seemed to be an awful lot of Hufflepuffs who decided that they wanted to sit next to Harry's banner. As the game dragged on past 9, there also seemed to be a lot of Gryffindors. As the sun set and Harry started using Lumos to read his books, he'd given up on the actual game a long time ago. There were a noticeable number of Ravenclaws who betrayed patriotism for sanity, and Professor Sinistra, and Professor Vector, and as the stars began to come out, Professor Flitwick. The climactic final Quidditch game of the year dragged on. One of the things Harry hadn't planned on when he'd decided to do this was that he would still be out here at Harry glanced at his watch, 11:04 at night. Harry was now reading a sixth-year Transfiguration textbook, or rather he'd weighted the book open, illuminated by a muggle glowstick, while he did one of the exercises. Last week, when the graduating Ravenclaws were discussing their NEWT scores, Harry had overheard that upper-year Transfiguration practice involved several shaping exercises that relied more on control and precise thinking than raw power, and Harry had promptly set out to learn those, whacking himself hard on the forehead for not trying to read all the later-year textbooks earlier. Professor McGonagall had approved Harry doing a shaping exercise that involved controlling the way in which a transfiguring object approached its final form. For example, transfiguring a quill so that the shaft grew out first, then the barbs. Harry was doing an analogous exercise with pencils, growing out the lead first, then surrounding it with wood, and finally having the eraser form on top. As Harry had suspected, focusing his attention and magic into a particular part of the pencil's ongoing transformation had proven similar to the mental discipline used in partial transfiguration, which could indeed have been used to fake the same effect by partially transfiguring only the outer layers of the object. This way was proving relatively easier, though. Harry finished his current pencil and looked up at the Quidditch game, which was, check, still fantastically boring. Lee Jordan was commentating in a tone of dull disgust. Another 10 points yay whoopee. And now someone takes possession of the quaffle again. Ask if I care who. Almost nobody remaining in the stands was paying attention either, since everyone who'd remained in the stadium seemed to have discovered a new and more interesting sport, the debate about how to amend the House Cup rules and/or Quidditch. The argument had become heated to the point where all of the nearby professors were barely keeping order at a level short of open combat. This argument, unfortunately, had considerably more than two factions. Some darned busybodies were proposing sensible-sounding alternatives to eliminating the snitch entirely, and this was threatening to split the vote and sap the momentum for reform. In retrospect, Harry thought it would have been nice to have Draco unfurl his own banner from the Slytherin side, saying, "Snitches are awesome," to set the polarity of the debate. Harry had squinted over at the Slytherin section earlier, but he hadn't been able to spot Draco anywhere in the stands. Severus Snape, who could also have been sympathetic enough to play the villainous opposition, was likewise nowhere to be seen. "Mr. Potter," said a voice next to him. Beside Harry's seat was standing a short but older Hufflepuff boy, someone who'd never before come to Harry's attention, holding out a blank parchment envelope with wax dripped on the front. The wax was also blank, without impression. "What is it?" said Harry. "It's me," said the boy. "With the envelope you gave me. I know you said not to talk to you, but then don't talk to me," Harry said. The boy tossed the envelope at Harry and walked away, looking offended. It made Harry wince a little, but it probably hadn't been the wrong decision considering the temporal issues. Then Harry broke the unsigned wax seal and drew out the envelope's contents. It was parchment instead of the muggle paper that Harry would have expected, but the writing on it was his own handwriting, if done with a quill instead of a pen. The parchment said, "Beware the constellation, and help the Watcher of Stars. Pass unseen by the Life-Eater's confederates, and by the wise and the well-meaning. 6 and 7 in a square, in the place that is prohibited and bloody stupid." Harry took it in at a glance, then folded the paper again and put it back into his cloak with another exhaled sigh. Beware the constellation, really. Harry would have expected a riddle left by himself to have been easier to interpret, though some parts were obvious enough. Clearly, future Harry had been worried about this paper being intercepted, and while present Harry wouldn't ordinarily have thought of the local auras as the ones in league with the Dementors of Azkaban, maybe that had been the best way to say aura, without potentially tipping off anyone else who read the parchment and did their own best to decrypt it. Translating the idiom back out of the parcel tongue he'd used during the incident with Azkaban. That worked, Harry supposed. The note had said that Professor Quirrell needed help, and that whatever was going on needed to pass unnoticed from the auras, and from Dumbledore and McGonagall and Flitwick. Since time turning was involved already, the obvious solution was to leave for the loo, travel back in time, and return to the game right after he'd left. Harry started to rise from his seat, then hesitated. His Hufflepuff side was remarking something about leaving the aura escorts behind and not telling Professor McGonagall anything, and wondering if his future self was being stupid. Harry unfolded the parchment again and took another glance at the contents. On closer examination, the riddle verse didn't say that Harry couldn't bring anyone along. Draco Malfoy. Was he missing from the Quidditch game because future Harry, hours in the past, had brought Draco with him as backup? But that didn't make sense. There wasn't much marginal improvement in safety from bringing along another first year. Draco Malfoy would certainly have been present, regardless of his personal feelings about Quidditch, to watch Slytherin clinch the House Cup. Had something happened to him, suddenly Harry didn't feel as tired anymore. A trickle of adrenaline was starting to rise in Harry, but no, this wouldn't be like the troll. The message had told Harry when to arrive. Harry wouldn't be too late, not this time. Harry glanced over at where Cedric Diggory was looking back and forth, visibly torn between a clutch of Ravenclaws, arguing that the snitch had to be kept, because it was traditional, and rules were rules, and a pack of Hufflepuffs saying that it wasn't fair for the Seeker to be more important than the other players. Cedric Diggory had been an excellent dueling tutor to Harry and Neville, and Harry had thought they'd established a good relationship. More importantly, a student taking literally all of the electives would have his own time turner. Maybe Harry could try to get Cedric to go back in time with him. The super Hufflepuff seemed like a good spare wand to have by your side in any sort of sticky situation. Later and earlier. Harry's watch now said 11:45, which translated into 6:45 p.m. after looping back 5 hours. "It's time," Harry murmured to the empty air, and began walking down the third-floor corridor above the grand staircase, on the right-hand side. The place that is prohibited would ordinarily mean the Forbidden Forest. That was probably what someone intercepting the message was meant to think. But the Forbidden Forest was huge, and there was more than one distinguished location inside it. No obvious shelling point at which to rendezvous or find some event that needed intervention. But when you added the bloody stupid modifier, there was only one prohibited place in Hogwarts that fit. And so Harry set forth on that outlawed path where, if rumor spoke true, all the first-year Gryffindors had gone before. The third-floor corridor, on the right-hand side. A mysterious door leading to a series of rooms filled with dangerous and potentially lethal traps that nobody could possibly get through, especially if they were only in their first year. Harry didn't know himself what sort of traps awaited, which, on reflection, meant that the students who'd gone through had been surprisingly scrupulous about not ruining the puzzle for others. Maybe there was a sign down there saying, "Don't give it away, just as a favor to me, sincerely, Headmaster Dumbledore." All Harry knew so far was that the outer door would open to Alohomora, and that the final room contained a magic mirror that would show your reflection in some situation you found highly appealing, which was apparently the big payoff. The third-floor corridor was illuminated by dim blue light that seemed to come from nowhere, and the arches were covered with cobwebs, as though the corridor hadn't been used in centuries rather than just the last year. Harry's pouch was loaded with useful muggle things and useful wizarding things, and everything he'd found that could possibly be a quest item. Harry had asked Professor McGonagall to recommend someone who could expand the pouch's capacity, and she'd just done it herself. Harry had applied the charm he'd learned for battles that made his eyeglasses stick to his face, regardless of how his head moved. Harry had refreshed the transfigurations he was maintaining, both the tiny jewel in the ring on his hand and the other one, in case he was knocked unconscious. He wasn't literally ready for anything, but Harry was as ready as he thought he could be. The five-sided floor tiles creaked beneath Harry's shoes and vanished behind him like the future becoming the past. It was almost 6, 49 6, and 7 in a square. Obvious if you thought in Muggle math, otherwise not so much. Just as Harry was about to round another corner, something tickled at the back of his mind, and he heard a soft voice talking. Sensible person. Wait until later, after certain faculty had departed. Harry stopped, then crept forward as lightly as he could, not going around the corner, trying to hear Professor Quirrell's voice better. There came a louder cough, and then the soft voice spoke again from around the corner. But if they were also to depart themselves at that time, murmured the voice, they might think this final game makes for the best distraction left in this year, a predictable distraction. So I looked to see what people of significance were not at the game, and I saw the headmaster missing. But for all my magic can tell me, he could be in another realm of existence. I also saw your own absence, so I decided to go where you were. That is what I am doing here. Now, what are you doing here? Harry breathed shallowly and listened. And just how did you know where I was? Drawled the voice of Severus Snape, so much louder that Harry nearly jumped, a small, coughing laugh. Check your wand for trace. Severus said something in magical pseudo-Latin, and then, you dared tamper with my wand, you dared. You are a suspect, just like myself, so your false indignation is wasted. However finely crafted it may be. Now tell me, what are you doing? I'm watching this door, said the voice of Professor Snape, and I will ask you to be off from it. On whose authority are you ordering me, my fellow professor? There was a pause then. Why, the headmaster's, came the smooth voice of Severus Snape. I was ordered by him to watch this door during the Quidditch match, and as a professor I must obey his whims. I shall have words about it with the Board of Governors later, but for now I am doing as I must. Now be off with you, as the headmaster desires. What, you mean I am to believe that you abandoned your Slytherins during their most important game of the year and leapt up like a dog at Dumbledore's word? Well, that, I must say, is entirely plausible. Even so, I think it would be wise if I kept my own watch over you while you watch this fine door. There was a sound of rustling cloth and a soft thud, as if someone had sat down hard upon the ground, or maybe just fallen. Oh, for the love of Merlin, Severus Snape's voice now sounded angry. Get up, you. Blah, said the defense professor's zombie mode. Get up, said Severus Snape, and there was a soft thud. Help the Watcher of Stars. Harry stepped around the corner, though it was possible that he'd have done so even without an intertemporal message. Had Professor Snape just kicked Professor Quirrell? That would have been foolhardy if Professor Quirrell had been dead and buried. A round-topped door of dark wood was framed within a stone arch, set within the dusty marble bricks of Hogwarts. Where a Muggle would have set a doorknob, there was only a handle of polished metal. There were no visible locks or visible keyholes. Set upon the wall to either side, a pair of torches burned, sending forth an ominous orange glow. Before the door stood the potions master in his customary stained robes. Beside the door, to the left side beneath the orange torch, slumped the form of the defense professor, back against the wall, head staring out at the surroundings. The eyes seemed to flicker, as if halfway between awareness and emptiness. What, said the towering form of the potions master, are you doing here, Potter? Going by facial expressions and tone of voice, the potions master was quite angry with Harry, and certainly was not Harry's co-conspirator in councils to which the defense professor had never been invited. I'm not sure, Harry said. He wasn't sure what role he should be playing, and was, in desperation, falling back on simple honesty. I think perhaps I'm supposed to be keeping an eye on the defense professor. The potions master stared at him coldly. Where's your escort, Potter? Students are not to wander these halls alone. Harry's mind was genuinely blank. The game was afoot, and nobody had told him the rules. I'm not sure how to answer that. The cold expression on Professor Snape's face flickered. Perhaps I should call the auras, he said. Wait, Harry blurted. The potions master's hand hovered about his robes. Why, said the potions master. I just think you probably shouldn't call them. In a blur, the potions master's wand was in his hand. Nullus confundio. A black jet darted out and hit Harry, striking in the direction Harry had already started to evade. There followed 4 other spells, containing words like polyflues and metamorphose, and for those Harry politely stood still. After all of those spells had failed to produce any effect, Severus Snape was staring at Harry with a dark glitter that now seemed genuine. "I suggest," the potions master said softly, "that you explain yourself, Potter." "I can't explain myself," Harry said. "I don't have the time, not yet." Harry looked directly into the potions master's gaze as he said the words myself and time, widening his own eyes to try to convey the key information, and the potions master hesitated. Harry was frantically trying to work out who was pretending to be what. Since Professor Quirrell wasn't in on Dumbledore's conspiracy, Severus was pretending to be the evil potions master of Hogwarts, who'd been sent here by the headmaster, and might or might not have actually been sent here by Dumbledore. But Professor Quirrell either thought, or was pretending to think, that someone needed to keep an eye on Professor Snape. And Harry himself had been sent here by future Harry, and had no idea why. And why were they all standing outside the headmaster's forbidden door in the first place? And then, from behind where Harry stood, came the growing sound of another set of footsteps, rapid and manifold. Professor Snape stabbed his wand once, creating a burst of darkness that shrouded where the defense professor was lying. "Muffliato," the potions master hissed. "Mr. Potter, if you must be here, then hide. Put on your invisibility cloak. My duty is to guard this door in case he comes here." And there has been a disturbance, meant to draw the headmaster, he thinks. Who? Severus took a long stride forward and snapped his wand against the side of Harry's head. There was a trickling sensation like an egg had been cracked over him, the feeling of a disillusionment charm, and Harry's hands faded out, followed by the rest of him. The darkness shrouding one side of the wall dissipated like slow mist, and there was again visible the huddled form of the defense professor, who said nothing. Harry tiptoed away quietly as he could, then turned to watch. The approaching footsteps rounded the corner. "What are you doing here?" came many simultaneous cries. Trimmed in 3 sets of slithering green and 1 Hufflepuff yellow stood Theodore Nott, Daphne Greengrass, Susan Bones, and Tracy Davis. "Where," said Professor Snape with mounting wrath, "are your escorts, children? First years must be accompanied by a 6th or 7th year student at all times, especially you." Theodore Nott raised his hand. "We're, said Theodore Nott. "We're doing what the Chaos Legion calls a team-building exercise. See, we realized just now that none of us had tried the headmaster's forbidden chamber yet, and there wasn't much time left. And Harry Potter has authorized it, Professor. He said specifically that you mustn't interfere." Severus Snape turned to glance over at where Harry Potter had tiptoed. A storm seemed to be gathering on his brow, and a dark fury in his eyes. Maybe. There was still 1 hour left on Harry's time turner, so it was possible. "Harry Potter does not have that authority," the potions master said in a deceptively mild tone. "Explain yourselves now." "Really?" said the form of Susan Bones. "Really? You're telling Professor Snape that Harry Potter authorized the mission? That's your idea of a bluff." The young Hufflepuff turned to Professor Snape and spoke, her voice strangely firm. "Professor, this is the truth, and it's urgent. Draco Malfoy is missing, and we think he went down there. If Mr. Malfoy is missing," said Professor Snape, "why have the Aurors not been notified?" Because of reasons," cried Daphne Greengrass. "There's no time, you've got to let us through." Professor Snape's voice was now as sardonic as Harry had ever heard it. "Are you 4 morons under the impression that you are on some sort of adventure? Well, you are mistaken. I assure you that Mr. Malfoy has not passed through this door." "We think Mr. Malfoy has an invisibility cloak," Susan Bones said rapidly. "Do you remember the door seeming to open for no reason?" "No," the potions master said. "Now be gone from here. This place is off limits for today." "This is Dumbledore's forbidden corridor," Tracy said. "The headmaster himself said nobody was to come here. Who do you think you are, forbidding it too?" "Miss Davis," said the potions master, "you need to stop associating with Gryffindors, especially those named Lavender Brown. And if you are still here in 1 minute, I will file papers requesting your transfer into that house." "You wouldn't dare," shrieked Tracy. Susan Bones said, her face screwed up in concentration. "Professor Snape, do you occasionally open the door yourself to check on whatever's inside?" Professor Snape froze in place. Then he spun and put his right hand on the metal knocker. Harry was watching the hand on the knocker, so he didn't notice what Professor Snape was doing with his left hand until he heard the sudden outcry. "No, in fact," said Professor Snape, now holding the choking head of Draco Malfoy by his collar, though the rest of Draco was still underneath his invisibility cloak. "A fine try, though." "What?" cried Tracy and Daphne. Susan Bones hit herself in the forehead. "I can't believe I fell for that." "So, Mr. Malfoy," Professor Snape said, his voice had lowered, "you sent your friends here on a ruse, just in the hopes that you could pass through this door. Now why would you do that?" "I think we should trust him," said Theodore Nott. "Mr. Malfoy, we've got to trust him. He's the one professor who would take our side." "No," cried Draco's floating head from where Professor Snape was still grasping his collar. "You mustn't say anything. Stop." "We've got to take the chance," yelled Theodore. "Professor Snape, Mr. Malfoy finally worked out what's been going on this whole year and why Dumbledore is trying to get the Philosopher's Stone away from Nicholas Flamel. Because Dumbledore doesn't think anyone ought to have immortality. So Dumbledore tried to convince Flamel that the Dark Lord was coming back and needed the stone to revive, and asked Flamel to give it to him, but Flamel wouldn't, and instead Flamel put the stone in the magic mirror that's down there, and Dumbledore is finding out right now how to get it, and then he'll come for it, and we've got to get to it first. Dumbledore really will be all-powerful if he gets the Philosopher's Stone." "What?" said Tracy. "That's not what you said before." Daphne said. She looked frightened, but determined. "It doesn't matter, Professor Snape, please. You have to believe me. I looked at the books Hermione checked out of the library, and she was researching the Philosopher's Stone just before someone killed her. Her notes said that something dangerous might happen if the stone stays inside the mirror too long. We have to get it out of the castle right away." Susan Bones now had both hands over her face. "I'm not with them. I just came along to prevent anything even stupider from happening." Severus Snape was staring at Theodore Nott and the others. Then he turned his head to look at Draco Malfoy. "Mr. Malfoy," the potion's master drawled, "how did you come to discover Dumbledore's plot?" "I deduced it from evidence," said Draco Malfoy's floating head. Professor Snape's head swiveled back to Theodore Nott. "How did you intend to obtain this stone from inside a magic mirror that could supposedly baffle Dumbledore himself? Answer me at once." "We're going to take the whole mirror and send it back to Flamel," said Theodore Nott. "It's not like we want the stone for ourselves. We just need to stop Dumbledore from stealing it." Professor Snape nodded, as though confirming something, and turned his head to look at the other students. "Tell me, have any of you noticed one of the others behaving in an unusual fashion? Especially if there is a peculiar object that they have in their possession, or they can use spells a first year should not know." Professor Snape's right hand now pointed his wand at Susan Bones. "I see that Miss Greengrass and Miss Davis are trying not to look at you, Miss Bones. If there is a mundane explanation, you would be wise to offer it immediately." Susan Bones's hair turned bright red, though her face didn't change. "I suppose there's not much point keeping it mum any longer," she said, "since I'm graduating in 2 days anyway." "Double witches get to graduate 6 years early," said Tracy Davis. "That's not fair." "Bones is a double witch," cried Theodore. "No, she is Nymphadora Tonks, a metamorph magus," Professor Snape said. "Masquerading as another student is extremely against regulation, as you are well aware, Miss Tonks. It is not too late to expel you from Hogwarts 2 days before your graduation, which would be a dreadful tragedy. From your perspective, that is. From my perspective, it would be hilarious. Now tell me what exactly you are doing here." "That explains it," said Daphne Greengrass. Is there actually a Susan Bones, or is the house dying out so they had you secretly?" The red-haired form of Susan Bones had a palm to her face. "Yes, Miss Greengrass, there's a real Susan Bones. She only sends me in when you lot are about to get into ridiculous amounts of trouble. Professor Snape, the reason I'm here is because Draco Malfoy was missing, and this lot insisted on trying to find him instead of calling the Auras. For reasons the real Miss Bones said there was no time to explain to me, which I now realize was stupid. But young students must never go alone, and must be accompanied by a 6th or 7th year at all times. And now we found Draco Malfoy, and we can all go back. Please, before this gets any more ridiculous. What in Merlin's name is going on here?" "Ah," said Professor Snape, who was still pointing the wand at the red-haired form of Susan Bones, his other hand still grasping the collar below the disembodied head of Draco Malfoy, standing next to the crumpled form of the defense professor. "Professor Sprout, I perceive. It's not what it looks like," volunteered Tracy Davis. The short, dumpy form of the herbology professor stormed forwards. She had, by this point, drawn her wand, though she wasn't pointing it at anyone. "I don't even know what this looks like. Down wands, all of you right now, including you, Professor." Distraction. The thought came to Harry with sudden clarity. Whatever he was watching now, from where he stood invisibly and well back of the action, it wasn't what was really going on. It wasn't the true thread of the story. It had been arranged. Professor Sprout's arrival had broken Harry's suspension of disbelief. Things like that didn't happen just for the sake of comedic coincidence. Someone was deliberately causing all this chaos. But what was the point? Harry really hoped he hadn't gone back in time and done this, because it did seem like the sort of thing he would do. Severus Snape lowered his wand. His other hand unfisted Draco Malfoy. "Professor Sprout," the potions master said, "I am here on the headmaster's orders to watch this door. Everyone else present is not supposed to be here, and I ask you to see them cleared away." "A likely story," snapped Professor Sprout. "Why would Dumbledore set you of all people to guard the door to his playground? It's not as if he wants to keep the students out. Oh no, they need to go in and get stuck in my devil's snare. Susan, dear, you've got a communications mirror, don't you? Use it to call the auras." The watching Harry nodded to himself. That was the point. The auras would take away everyone present at this terribly confusing situation, no excuses accepted, and then the door would be unguarded. But was Harry meant to go into the forbidden corridor himself, or watch, to see who finally came once all the others were gone? A loud fit of hacking and coughing caused everyone to look at where the defense professor lay. "Snape, listen," said the defense professor between coughs. "Why Sprout here?" The potions master looked down. "Memory charm implies professor." The defense professor began coughing again. "What?" And the logic unfolded in Harry's mind in crystalline dismay, all the steps already suspected, the dreadful realization coming as a repetition with greater confidence. Someone had memory charmed Hermione to believe she tried to kill Draco. Only a Hogwarts professor could have done it without alarm. So all the true mastermind needed to do was legitimize, or Imperius, a Hogwarts professor. And the last person anyone would suspect would be the head of House Hufflepuff. Snape's head snapped around as Professor Sprout raised her wand, and the potions master managed to raise a wordless, translucent ward between them. But the bolt that shot from Professor Sprout's wand was a dark brown that produced a surge of awful apprehension in Harry's mind. And the brown bolt made Severus's shield wink out before they touched, clipping the potions master's right arm even as he dodged. Professor Snape gave a muffled shriek, and his hand spasmed, dropping his wand. The next bolt that came from Sprout's wand was a bright red, the color of a stunning hex, seeming to grow brighter and move faster even as it left her wand, accompanied by another surge of anxiety, and that blew the potions master into the door, dropping him motionless to the ground. By that time, pink-haired Susan Bones was surrounded by a multifaceted blue haze, and she was firing hex after hex at Professor Sprout. Professor Sprout was ignoring the hexes to summon plant tendrils that entangled the younger students as they tried to run, except Draco Malfoy, who had again vanished beneath his invisibility cloak. Not Susan Bones stopped casting hexes. She leveled her wand, took a deep breath, and cried aloud an incantation that sent golden worms of light chewing into the shield around Professor Sprout. At that, the herbology professor turned to face not Susan, her expression vacant, a new set of plant tentacles rising in the air behind her. Those stalks were a darker green and seemed to have shields of their own. Harry Potter murmured to the seemingly empty air, "Attack Sprout. Help Bones. Non-lethal only." "Yes, my lord," whispered Lesseth Lestrange beneath Harry's cloak of invisibility, and the fifth-year Slytherin's presence moved off toward the fight. Harry looked down at his own hands and saw with a jolt of unpleasant shock that his disillusionment charm wasn't as complete as it had been before. There were hints of distortion in the air each time Harry moved. Slowly, Harry stepped backward until he came to a corner and ducked behind a wall. Then he took out his communications mirror, which was blank and jammed. Of course. Harry levitated the mirror to where he could use it to see around the corner and watch the end of the distraction. What was happening? Why? Professor Sprout and the form of Susan Bones were dueling in flashes of light and leaves, and the blazing green of a greater drill hex erupted from midair and chewed halfway through the outer layer of Professor Sprout's shields. The herbology professor turned and fired a broad wash of yellow at where the drill hex had come from, but the spell didn't seem to hit anything. Yellow blazes, blue facets, dark green plant tendrils, and swirling purple flower petals. It was when Professor Sprout started firing arcs of crimson in all directions that one of the crimson blades caught something in midair. The invisibility cloak not concealing how the crimson arc was absorbed and winked out, and Lesseth's presence beneath the invisibility cloak fell to the ground. And that gave not Susan Bones time enough to stand still, catch her breath, and scream something that inspired in Harry another surge of dread. And the white spark that blazed out went through Professor Sprout's chewed shields and her plant armor and dropped her. Not Susan Bones went to her knees, panting, her robes soaked in sweat. Her head turned to look around her at the bodies lying stunned on the floor or wrapped in vines. "What?" said Not Susan. "What? What? What?" There was no reply. The victims entangled in Professor Sprout's vines weren't moving, though they did seem to be breathing. "Malfoy," said the pink-haired form of Susan, still gasping for breath. "Draco Malfoy, where are you? Are you there? Call the auras already. Merlin, damn it, Homnum Revelio." And Harry found himself visible again, staring in his mirror at the form of Draco Malfoy half visible beneath a shimmering cloak, standing behind Not Susan, pointing his wand at a gap in Not Susan's blue haze. Harry's mind moved in flashes of insight, too slow and yet too fast, even as Harry's mouth opened and he inhaled in preparation to shout. Beware the constellation. There was a constellation named Draco. If you could control a professor, you could control a student. Duck! Harry shouted, but it was too late. A bolt of red light caught the back of Not Susan's head at point blank, smashing her to the floor. Harry stepped around the corner and said, "Somnium, somnium, 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 somnium." Draco Malfoy's shimmering form collapsed in a heap. Harry took a moment to catch his breath. Then Harry said, "Stupefy," and verified that, yes, the stunning hex did hit Draco Malfoy's form. You could be mistaken about whether a somnium had really hit. Harry had seen enough horror movies, not to mention the business with the Sunshine Regiment, that he wasn't about to make that error again. After a further reflection on this, Harry cast another stunning hex into the prostrate form of Professor Sprout. Harry gripped his wand, staring at the scene, breathing heavily from the exhaustion. He didn't have enough magic left to cast a messenger patronus to Dumbledore, and he really should have thought of that possibility immediately this time around. Harry started to reach back to where his mirror had fallen to see if it was now unjammed. And then Harry hesitated. His note to himself had said to avoid notice from auras, and Harry still did not know what was going on. The crumpled form of Professor Quirrell gave another series of racking coughs, reached out a hand to the wall beside him, and slowly pulled himself to his feet. "Harry," croaked Professor Quirrell. "Harry, are you there?" It was the first time Professor Quirrell had ever called him by his first name. "I'm here," Harry said. Without any conscious thought, his feet were moving forward. "Please," said Professor Quirrell, "please, I haven't much time. Please take me to the mirror. Help me get the stone." "The Philosopher's Stone," Harry said. He glanced around at the scattered bodies, but he couldn't see Draco anymore. The revealment had worn off. "You think Mr. Nott was right? I don't think Dumbledore would." "Not Dumbledore," gasped Professor Quirrell. "Because Sprout, I understand," Harry said. If Dumbledore had been the one behind it all, he wouldn't have needed to mind control a professor in order to use memory charms. Mirror, ancient relic, could hide anything. Stone could be there. Many others want stone. 1 cent Sprout. Harry repeated rapidly. The mirror down there is an ancient relic that can be used to hide things, and it would be one possible place to hide the Philosopher's Stone. If the Philosopher's Stone is inside the mirror, then any number of people might want to get it. One of them is controlling Sprout, and that would explain what their goal really is. Only, that doesn't explain why Sprout's controller would go after Hermione. "Harry, please," Professor Quirrell said. His breathing was yet more labored now. His voice came with excruciating slowness. "It's the one thing that can save my life, and I find now I don't want to die. Please help me. And somehow that tore it. Somehow that was a little too much. The sense of detachment that had come over Harry when Professor Sprout had arrived, the broken suspension of disbelief, was returning, his inner critic weighing up everything as though it were a set piece. Timing, probability, so many people showing up at the same door, the defense professor's desperation. This whole situation didn't feel real. But he might be able to solve it if he just took time to think things through in advance, instead of running off at adventure's first call. All the accumulated experience from the last year had finally crystallized into something like a touch of battle hardening. An instinct born of past disaster was telling Harry that if he just rushed on ahead, he would end up afterward in a sad conversation, realizing that he'd been stupid. Again. Let me think, Harry said. Let me think for a minute before we go. He turned away from the defense professor, looking at the unconscious bodies draped in various shapes over the floor. There had been so many puzzle pieces already this last year, maybe everything would just fall into place with one more piece. Harry, the defense professor said in a faltering voice. Harry, I'm dying. One more minute can't make the difference he's had the whole year to be sick. It's improbable that his life versus death would be precisely timed to rest on this last minute, no matter what happened to Hermione. I know, Harry said. I'll think quickly. Harry stared at the bodies and tried to think. There was no time for doubts, for caveats, no breaks or second-guessing. Just take the first thoughts and run with them. In the back of Harry's mind, fragments of abstract thought flitted past, heuristics of problem-solving that there was no time to rehearse in words. In wordless flashes they shot past to set up the object-level problem. What do I notice I am confused by? The first place to look for a problem is whatever aspect of the situation seems most improbable. Simple explanations are more probable. Eliminate separate improbabilities that must be postulated. Professor Snape had already been here, then Professor Quirrell had arrived, then Harry had arrived, via Time Turner. Then the adventuring party had arrived, and Draco had been revealed, part of the party. Then Professor Sprout had shown up. Too many people had shown up synchronously, and that was too much coincidence. It was improbable that so many different parties would show up at the same location within a 5-minute window. There had to be hidden entanglements. Label Sprout's controller as the mastermind who had ordered Hermione memory charmed. The mastermind had sent Sprout. Professor Snape had said that the headmaster had sent him to guard the door after there had been some sort of disturbance. If the mastermind had caused that as a distraction, then that explained Severus's presence as well. Harry wasn't sure anymore that Draco had been controlled by the mastermind. That hypothesis had come to him in the spur of the moment. Draco might have just been trying to drop Nart Susan so he could get into the corridor unhindered. No, that was the wrong way to think. Turn it around. Try to explain the timed presence of Draco and his adventuring party. No time for self-questioning. Run with the hypothesis. Therefore, suppose Sprout's mastermind had sent Draco or triggered his coming. That was 3 arrivals explained. Harry had shown up because his note to himself had told him to do so. That could be attributed to time travel. That left the defense professor who'd said he was following Snape. Only that didn't really seem like an adequate reason for Professor Quirrell to show up. It didn't really make Harry feel less confused. And so maybe the mastermind had also controlled the timing of Professor Quirrell's presence somehow, and even arranged for Harry himself to enter the time loop. Harry's mind hit a stumbling block. He couldn't see how to extend that reasoning further. There was no time to stare blankly at stumbling blocks. Without any pause or breaking, Harry's mind attacked the problem from a new angle. Professor Quirrell had deduced a controlled Hogwarts professor from the need for some professor to memory charm Hermione, which meant that Professor Sprout's controller had framed and then murdered Hermione, which meant Professor Sprout's controller had detailed information about Hogwarts life and maybe a personal interest in the boy who lived and his friends. Harry's mind finally threw up the relevant memory. Dumbledore saying that Lord Voldemort's strongest road to life was hidden here inside Hogwarts, run with the hypothesis. So that resurrection tool was the Philosopher's Stone hidden inside the mirror. Why had Dumbledore put the mirror into a corridor first years could get through? No, ignore this question. It's not important right now. And Professor Quirrell had said the Philosopher's Stone possessed great healing power, so that part also fit. But if it was the Philosopher's Stone that was hidden in the mirror to keep it away from the Dark Lord, that meant the mirror also contained the one thing in the world that could save the defense professor's life. Harry's mind tried to hesitate, to flinch away, feeling a sudden apprehension as to where this was going. But there was no time allowed for hesitation. And that was also far too much coincidence, just too much improbability, if your mind didn't write it off as an amazing plot twist like you were inside a story. Could the putative Dark Lord also be manipulating Professor Quirrell so that Professor Quirrell would discover his supposed salvation at the right time, so that Harry and Professor Quirrell would go get the resurrection tool from the mirror that might not even actually be the Philosopher's Stone? And then the Dark Lord's avatar, or some other servant, would show up and seize it from them, that would explain all the synchronies and negate every coincidence. Or Professor Quirrell had known from the beginning that the one thing that could save his life was hidden inside this mirror, and that was why he had agreed to teach defense at Hogwarts. And now he was finally trying to get it. But then why wait until he was this sick to even try? And why had Sprout shown up at the same time? As Professor Quirrell, Harry's mind faltered harder. His inner eye was looking in a direction it was afraid to look. The note I sent myself said to help the Watcher of Stars. I wouldn't send myself a note saying that. If I hadn't already worked out in the future that it was the right thing to do, maybe the note is just telling me to get on with it. A small note of confusion was promoted to conscious attention. The coded message on the parchment. 1 or 2 lines hadn't quite sounded right, hadn't sounded like the code Harry would expect himself to use. "Harry," whispered the dying voice of Professor Quirrell from behind him. "Harry, please." "I'm almost done thinking," Harry's voice said aloud, and Harry realized as he spoke the words that they were true. Turn it around. Look at it from the enemy's perspective, from where the enemy does their own intelligent planning, somewhere out of your sight. There are auras in Hogwarts, and your target Harry Potter is now fully on guard. Harry Potter will call in auras at the first sign of trouble or send a Patronus to Albus Dumbledore. Considering that as a puzzle, one creative solution is to forge a supposedly time-turned message to Harry Potter from himself, telling Harry Potter not to call for help, telling him to be at the place and time you want him to be. You get the target himself to bypass all the protections he set up. You even bypass his protection of skepticism with the overriding authority of his own future self's judgment. It isn't even difficult. You can memory charm some random student into remembering Harry Potter, handing over an envelope to be given back to himself later. You can memory charm that student because you are a Hogwarts professor. You don't go to the extra effort to steal a pencil and muggle paper from Harry Potter's pouch. Instead, you forge Harry Potter's handwriting on wizard parchment. You can forge Harry Potter's handwriting because you have seen it on ministry-mandated exams you have graded. You call Draco Malfoy the constellation because you know Harry Potter is interested in astronomy and you are a wizard and you have taken astronomy and memorized the names of all the constellations. But it's not the natural code that Harry Potter would use to describe Draco Malfoy to himself. That would have been the apprentice. You call Professor Quirrell the Watcher of Stars and tell Harry Potter to help him. You know that Life Eater is how you say Dementor in Parseltongue, and you expect Harry Potter to think of the auras as being in league with them. You encode 6, 49 as 6, and 7 in a square, because you have been reading a Muggle physics book that Harry Potter gave you. Who are you, then? Harry noticed his breathing had sped up, and with a burst of heart rate, Harry slowed his breath down again. Professor Quirrell was watching him. If hypothetically speaking Professor Quirrell was the mastermind and had faked Harry's message, then that explained all 5 parties showing up the whole synchronous coordination of the comedy. And then Professor Sprout was just controlled to give Professor Quirrell deniability, let him blame someone else for the false memory charm after the dust settled. But why would Professor Quirrell risk the fragile alliance Harry had with Draco via the attempted murder frame that Professor Quirrell had detected and stopped, allegedly via a tracer put on Draco? Why would Professor Quirrell kill Hermione if his first attempt to remove her hadn't worked? If Professor Quirrell was the bad guy, then he might have lied about everything to do with Horcruxes And maybe it wasn't coincidence at all that the only thing that could save his life was the avenue that could resurrect the Dark Lord. What if the Dark Lord had arranged that too somehow? One day David Monroe had mysteriously disappeared. Presumed dead at the Dark Lord's hands, an awful intuition had come over Harry, something separate from all the reasoning he'd done so far, an intuition that Harry couldn't put into words. Except that he and the defense professor were very much alike in certain ways, and faking a time-turned message was just the sort of creative method that Harry himself might have tried to bypass all of a target's protections. And that was when Harry finally realized what should have been obvious from the very, very beginning. Professor Quirrell was smart. Professor Quirrell was smart in the same way as Harry. Professor Quirrell was smart in exactly the same way as Harry's mysterious dark side. If you had to guess when the boy who lived had acquired his mysterious dark side, the obvious guess was the night of October 31st, 1981. And then Professor Quirrell had known a password that Bellatrix Black had thought identified the Dark Lord, and his presence gave the boy who lived a sense of doom, and his magic interacted destructively with Harry's, and his favorite spell was Avada Kedavra. And then the realization blasted through Harry like a vast dam breaking, releasing out all its water, bursting through his mind in an irresistible flood that swept everything away. There is only one reality that generates all of the observations. If different observations seem to point in incompatible directions, it means the true hypothesis is one you haven't thought of yet. And in those cases, when you finally think of the correct hypothesis, everything aligns behind it, beyond denial or horror, tearing away every doubt and every emotion that might stand in its path. And then David Monroe and Lord Voldemort had just been one person playing both sides of the wizarding war, and that was why the Monroe family had been killed before they could meet David Monroe. Just like Moody had suspected, reality settled down into a single known state, one coherent state of affairs that compactly generated the observation set. Harry didn't jump, didn't change his breathing, tried not to show a single sign of the horror and agony flooding his mind. The enemy was behind him, watching him. "All right," Harry said out loud, as soon as he dared trust his voice to sound normal. He kept on staring at the bodies, looking away from Professor Quirrell, because Harry didn't trust his own face. Harry lifted a sleeve to wipe away the sweat on his forehead, trying to make the gesture look casual. Harry couldn't control the sweat or the rapid hammering in his chest. "Let's go get the Philosopher's Stone." All Harry needed was a single moment of distraction anywhere along the way to use his time turner. There was no reply from behind him. The silence stretched. Slowly, Harry turned around. Professor Quirrell was standing upright and smiling. In the defense, Professor's hand was a shape of black metal pointed at Harry's wand arm, held with the sure grip of someone who knew exactly how to use a semi-automatic handgun. Harry's mouth was dry, even his lips were trembling with adrenaline, but he managed to speak. "Hello, Lord Voldemort." Professor Quirrell inclined his head in acknowledgement and said, "Hello, Tom Riddle. CH. 105 will post on February 16th, 2015 at 5 p.m. Pacific Time. There are no author's notes for CH. 104. 105. The Truth, PT2. Tom Riddle. The words seemed to echo inside Harry's head, sparking resonances that as quickly died away, broken patterns trying to complete themselves and failing. Tom Riddle is a Tom Riddle was the riddle. There were other priorities occupying Harry's attention. Professor Quirrell was pointing a gun at him, and for some reason Lord Voldemort hadn't fired it yet. Harry's voice came out in more of a croak. "What is it that you want from me?" "Your death," said Professor Quirrell, "is clearly not what I am about to say, since I have had plenty of time to kill you if I wished. The fateful battle between Lord Voldemort and the boy who lived is a figment of Dumbledore's imagination. I know where to find your family's house in Oxford, and I am familiar with the concept of sniper rifles. You would have died before you ever touched a wand. I hope this is clear to you, Tom." "Crystal," Harry whispered. His body was still shaking, running programs more suited to fleeing a tiger than casting delicate spells or thinking. But Harry could think of one thing the person pointing a gun at him obviously wanted him to do, a question that person was waiting for him to ask, and Harry did so. "Why are you calling me Tom?" Professor Quirrell regarded him steadily. Why am I calling you Tom? Answer. Your intellect is not everything I hoped for, but it should suffice for this. Harry's mouth seemed to know the answer before his brain could manage to focus on the question. Tom Riddle is your name. Our name. That's who Lord Voldemort is, or was, or something. Professor Quirrell nodded. Better. You have already vanquished the Dark Lord, the one and only time that you will ever do so. I have already destroyed all but a remnant of Harry Potter, eliminating the difference between our spirits and enabling us to reside in the same world. Now that it is clear to you that the battle between us is a lie, you might act sensibly to advance your own interests, or you might not. The gun jabbed slightly forward, causing prickles of sweat to appear on Harry's forehead. Drop your wand. Now, Harry dropped it. Step away from the wand, said Professor Quirrell. Harry obeyed. Reach toward your neck, said Professor Quirrell, and remove your time turner, touching it by the chain only. Place the time turner on the ground, then step away from it as well. This also Harry did. Even in his state of shock, his mind still looked for a way to spin the time turner in the process, a sudden move that would win. But Harry knew that Professor Quirrell would already be imagining himself in Harry's position, looking for the same possible opportunities. Remove your pouch and place it also on the ground, then step away. Harry did this. Very good, said the defense professor. Now, it is time for me to obtain the Philosopher's Stone. I mean to bring along these 4 first years here, suitably obliviated of their most recent memories, so that they still recall their original purpose. Snape, I shall control and set to guard this door. After this day's work is done, I intend to kill Snape for the betrayals he has offered my other identity. The 3 heir children I shall take with me afterwards to shape their future loyalties. And know this, I have taken hostages. I have already set in motion a spell that will kill hundreds of Hogwarts students, including many you called friends. I can stop that spell using the stone, if I obtain it successfully. If I am interrupted before then, or if I choose not to stop the spell, hundreds of students will die. Professor Quirrell's voice was still mild. Do you yet perceive any interest you have at stake, boy? I would smile to hear you say no, but that is too much to hope. I'd like, Harry managed to say, through the horror and the heartbreak, and the knives slicing away at an emotional connection that hurt like living flesh as it was cut, for you not to do those things, Professor. Why, Professor Quirrell, why did it have to turn out like this? I don't want this to be happening. Very well, Professor Quirrell said. I grant you permission to offer me something I want. The gun gestured invitingly. That is a rare privilege, child. Lord Voldemort does not usually negotiate for what he wants. Some part of Harry's mind scrabbled frantically, looking for something, anything that might be of more value to Lord Voldemort or Professor Quirrell than child hostages or Severus's death. Another part of him, the part that had never stopped thinking, already knew his answer. You already have an idea for what you want from me, Harry said, through the sickness and the bleeding wounds in his soul. What is it? Your help in obtaining the Philosopher's Stone. Harry swallowed. He couldn't stop his eyes from going to the gun, then back up at Professor Quirrell's face. He was aware that the hero in a storybook was supposed to say no, but now that he was actually in a situation like this, saying no didn't seem to make sense. I am disappointed that you need to think about this, said Professor Quirrell. It is straightforward that you should obey me for now, since I hold every advantage over you. I have taught you better than this. In this situation, you should certainly pretend to lose. You can expect to gain nothing by resisting, except pain. You should have calculated that it was better to answer sooner and not earn my distrust. Professor Quirrell's eyes studied him curiously. Perhaps Dumbledore has filled your ears with nonsense about noble defiance. I find such morals amusing, since they are so easy to manipulate. I assure you that I can make defiance seem morally worse, and you would be well advised to submit before I demonstrate how. The gun stayed pointed at Harry, but with a wave of Professor Quirrell's other hand, Tracy Davis rose up into the air, spun lazily, her limbs stretched out spread-eagle. Then, even as new adrenaline hammered at Harry's heart, Tracy floated back down again. Choose, said Professor Quirrell. This begins to try my patience. I should have spoken just then, before he might have ripped off Tracy's legs. No, I shouldn't have. The headmaster said I mustn't show Lord Voldemort that I'll do things if he threatens my friends, because that will just make him threaten more of them. Only what he said before isn't a threat. It's just the sort of thing Lord Voldemort does. Harry took a deep breath. Several of them. Whatever part of him kept on running on full automatic was screaming at the remainder of his mind that it could not afford to stay in shock. Shocks were of finite duration. Neurons kept firing regardless. The only reason Harry's mind would shut down while his brain kept running was if Harry's self-model believed his mind would shut down. "I don't mean to try your patience," Harry said. His voice was cracking. That was good. Sounding like he was still in shock meant that Lord Voldemort might give him more time. But if Lord Voldemort had a reputation for keeping his bargains, I don't know about it. An obvious concern, Professor Quirrell said. There is a simple answer, and I would have enforced it upon you in any case. Snakes can't lie, and since I have a tremendous distaste for stupidity, I suggest you do not say anything like, "What do you mean?" You are smarter than that, and I do not have time for such conversations as ordinary people inflict on one another. Harry swallowed. Snakes can't lie. 2 plus 2 equals 4. Harry had tried to say that 2 plus 2 equaled 3, and the word 4 had slipped out instead. Good. When Salazar Slytherin invoked the Parselmouth curse upon himself and all his children, his true plan was to ensure his descendants could trust one another's words, whatever plots they wove against outsiders. Professor Quirrell had adopted his lecturing pose from battle magic, like someone putting on a well-worn mask, but the gun remained pointed in his hand. Occlumency cannot fool the Parselmouth curse as it can fool Veritaserum, and you may put that to the trial also. Now listen well. Come with me, promise your best aid in getting S-Stone, and I shall leave Thess children behind unharmed. Hostages are real. Hundreds of S-students die tonight, unless I S-stop events already S-set in motion. Will S spare hostages if I obtain S-Stone S successfully? And mark also this, mark it well. I cannot be truly S-slain by any means known to me, and lossing S-Stone will not S-stop me from returning, nor S-spare you or yours my wrath. Any impetuous act you are contemplating cannot win the game for you, boy. I do credit your ability to annoy me, and suggest you avoid doing so. You said, Harry's voice was strange in his own ears, that the Philosopher's Stone had different powers from what legend said. You said that to me in Parseltongue. Tell me what the stone really does before I agree to help you get it. If it was something along the lines of gaining total power over the universe, then nothing was worth an incrementally greater chance of Lord Voldemort getting the stone. Ah, said Professor Quirrell, and smiled. You are thinking. That is better, and as a reward I shall offer you a further incentive for cooperation. Eternal life and youth, the creation of gold and silver. Suppose these are true benefits of holding the stone. Tell me, boy, what is the stone's power? It might have been the adrenaline still in him, being actually useful for his brain for once. It might have been the power of being told that an answer existed and that the evidence wasn't a lie. It can make transfigurations permanent. Then Harry stopped, as he heard what his own mouth had just said. Correct, said Professor Quirrell. Thus, whoever holds the Philosopher's Stone is able to perform human transfiguration. Harry's torn mind was knocked about yet again as he realized what further incentive would be offered him. You stole Miss Granger's remains and transfigured them into some innocuous-appearing target, said Professor Quirrell. A transfigured target that you must keep somewhere about your own person in order to sustain the transfiguration. Ah, I see your eyes going to that ring upon your hand, but of course Miss Granger would not be the little jewel set into the ring, would it? That would be too obvious. No, I expect you transfigured Granger's remains into the ring itself, letting the aura of the transfigured jewel mask the magic in the transfigured ring. Yes, Harry said, forcing out the word. It was a lie, for once, and Harry's glance had been deliberate. Harry had expected someone to challenge him on the steel ring. He tried to provoke that challenge so he could prove to be innocent yet again, though nobody had taken him up on it. Maybe Dumbledore had just sensed that the steel by itself wasn't magical. Fine and good, said Professor Quirrell. Now come with me, help me to obtain the stone, and I will resurrect Hermione Granger on your behalf. Her death has had unfortunate effects on you, and I would not mind undoing them. That, as I understand you, is your greatest desire. I have done you many kindnesses, and I would not mind doing you this one more. A blank-eyed Professor Sprout had now risen from the ground and was pointing her own wand at Harry. Help me obtain Stone of Transfiguration, and I shall try my hardest to resurrect your girl-child friend to true and lasting life. That said, boy, I am swiftly running out of patience with you, and you shall not like what commence next. This last line was hissed out in a voice that conveyed the impression of a snake rearing its head to strike. Even then, even then, with all the world upturned, with shock after shock, even then Harry's brain did not stop being a brain, or completing the patterns its circuits had been wired to complete. Harry knew that this was too good an offer to make to someone at whom you were pointing a gun. Unless you desperately needed their help to get the Philosopher's Stone out of the magic mirror. There wasn't any time left to plan, only the thought that, if Professor Quirrell really was going this far to get his help, what Harry wanted was to demand Professor Quirrell promise not to kill anyone in the future in exchange for his help now. But Harry had a strong sense that Professor Quirrell would reply, "Don't be ridiculous." And there wasn't time for ordinary conversation. Harry had to guess the highest safe request in advance. Professor Quirrell's eyes narrowed, his lips parted. "If I help," Harry's mouth said, "I want your promise that you aren't planning to turn on me when this is over. I want you to not kill Professor Snape or anyone else in Hogwarts for at least a week. And I want answers, the truth about everything that's been going on this whole time, everything you know about my nature." The pale blue eyes regarded him dispassionately. "I really think we could have thought of something better to ask for than that," said Harry's Slytherin side. "But I suppose we were legitimately out of time, and whatever we need to do next, answers will help." Harry wasn't listening to that voice right now. Cold chills were still going down his spine from hearing the words that had just come out of his lips, addressed to the man with the gun. "That is your condition for helping me to obtain the stone," said Professor Quirrell. Harry nodded, unable to form words. "Agreed," hissed Professor Quirrell. "Help me, and you shall have answers to your questions. So long as they are about past events, and not my plans for the future. I do not intend to raise my hand or magic against you in future, so long as you do not raise your hand or magic against me. Shall kill none within school grounds for a week, unless I must. Now promise that you will not attempt to warn against me or escape. Promise to put forth your own best efforts toward helping me to obtain the stone. And your girl-child friend shall be revived by me to true life and health, nor shall me or mine ever seek to harm her." A twisted smile. "Promise, boy, and the bargain will be struck." "I promise," whispered Harry. "What?" screamed other parts of his mind. He's still pointing a gun at us," pointed out Slytherin. "We don't actually have a choice. We're just getting as much mileage out of this as possible." "You bastard," said Hufflepuff. "Do you think this is what Hermione would have wanted? This is Lord Voldemort we're talking about. Do we even know how many people he's killed and will kill?" "I deny that we are compromising with Lord Voldemort for Hermione's sake," said Slytherin, "since there is, in fact, a gun and we can't otherwise stop him. Also, Mum and Dad would want us to just go along and stay safe." Professor Quirrell regarded him steadily. "Repeat the full promise in Parseltongue, boy. I shall help you obtain the stone." "I cannot promise I will us my best efforts. My heart will not be in it, I fear. I intend to try. Shall not do anything I think will annoy you to no good end. Shall call no help if I expect them to be killed by you or for hostages to die. I'm sorry, teacher, but it is best I can do." Harry's mind was settling, composing itself as the decision was made. He would stay with Professor Quirrell, go with him to get the stone, save the student hostages, and Harry didn't know, except that he'd go on thinking. "You actually are sorry about that." Professor Quirrell looked amused. "I suppose it shall have to do. Then keep two other things in mind. I have planned to stop even schoolmaster if he appears before us. And also this, I will occasionally ask you to say in Parseltongue whether you have betrayed me. The bargain is struck." After that, Professor Sprout picked up Harry's wand and wrapped it in shimmering cloth. Then she placed it on the floor and again pointed her wand at Harry. Only then did Professor Quirrell lower his gun, which seemed to disappear into his hand, and pick up Harry's wrapped wand, tucking it into his robes. The true cloak of invisibility was removed from the sleeping form of Lessath Lestrange, and Professor Quirrell took the cloak, as well as Harry's pouch and Time Turner. Then Professor Quirrell cast a mass obliviation, followed by the mass version of the false memory charm. the one that just had the subject fill in the blanks using their own suggestibility on all the students present. Afterwards, Professor Sprout floated away the sleeping children, now wearing an expression that seemed annoyed and preoccupied, as if they'd been in some herbology accident. Professor Quirrell then turned back to where the potion's master lay sprawled, bent over and placed his wand on Professor Snape's forehead. Aliene's nervous, mobile lignum. The defense professor stepped back and began to move his left fingers in the air as though manipulating a puppet on strings. Professor Snape pushed himself up from the ground by smooth motions and stood once more before the corridor door. "Alohomora," Professor Quirrell said, pointing his wand at the forbidden door. The defense professor looked rather amused. "Would you do the honors, boy?" Harry swallowed. He was once again having second thoughts and third thoughts. It was strange how you could do something even while knowing it was the wrong thing, not the selfish thing, but the wrong thing to do on some deeper level. But the man behind him was holding the gun. It had once more appeared in his hand at Harry's hesitation. Harry laid his hand on the door knocker and took several deep breaths, again composing his mind as best he could. Go through with it, don't get shot, don't let the hostages die, be there to optimize events, be there to watch for opportunities and stay capable of taking them. It wasn't a good choice, but all the other ones seemed worse. Harry pushed open the forbidden door and stepped through. The next short chapter will post on February 17th, 2015 at 5 p.m. Pacific Time. 106. The Truth, PT3. After a single step into Dumbledore's forbidden chamber, Harry shrieked and jumped back and collided with Professor Snape, sending the two of them down in a heap. Professor Snape picked himself up and resumed standing in front of the door. His head tracked to look at Harry. "I am guarding this door at the headmaster's orders," said Professor Snape in his usual sardonic tones. "Be off with you at once, or I shall deduct house points." This was bone-chillingly creepy, but Harry's attention was occupied by the gigantic three-headed dog which had lunged forward, only to be stopped meters from Harry by the chains upon its three collars. That, Harry said. "Yes," Professor Quirrell said from a ways behind him. "That is indeed the usual occupant of that chamber, which is off-limits to all students, especially first years. That's not safe even by wizard standards." Within the chamber, the enormous black beast gave a multi-voiced bellow, flecks of white saliva flying from three fanged mouths. Professor Quirrell sighed. "It is enchanted not to eat students, just spit them back out through the door. Now, boy, how would you recommend that we deal with this dangerous creature?" "Ah," Harry stuttered, trying to think over the continued roaring of the chamber's guardian. "Ah. If it's like the Cerberus from the Muggle legend of Orpheus and Eurydice, then we have to sing it to sleep so we can pass. Avada Kedavra." The three-headed beast fell over. Harry looked back at Professor Quirrell, who was giving him a look of extreme disappointment, as if to ask whether Harry had attended any of his classes, ever. "I sort of assumed," Harry said, still trying to catch his breath, "that going through this challenge in any way except the one used by first years might perhaps trigger an alarm." "That is a lie, boy. You simply did not remember your lessons when you faced the occasion in true life. As for alarms, I have spent months befuddling all the wards and tripsins upon these chambers." "Then why did you send me in first, exactly?" Professor Quirrell just smiled. It looked significantly more evil than usual. "Never mind," Harry said, and walked slowly into the chamber, his limbs still shaking. The chamber was all of stone, illuminated by a pale blue light that shone from arched nooks carved into the wall, as if the light of a grey sky were passing through windows, though there were no windows. At the far end of the chamber was a wooden trapdoor upon the floor, with a single ring attached. In the middle of the chamber lay a gigantic dead dog with three lifeless heads. Harry turned toward one of the arched nooks and looked inside it. There was nothing there but the sourceless blue glow, so he walked over and looked in the next one, also scrutinizing the wall as he passed. "What?" said Professor Quirrell. "Are you doing?" "Searching the room," Harry said. "There could be a clue or an inscription or a key we'll need later or something. Are you serious, or are you deliberately trying to slow us down? Answer in Parseltongue." Harry looked back. "Was es serious?" hissed Harry. "Would have done es same if came by myself." Professor Quirrell briefly massaged his forehead. "I confess," he said, that your approach would serve you well in, say, exploring the Tomb of Ammon set, so I will not quite call you an idiot, but still. The false puzzle, the outer form of the challenge, is a game meant for first years. We simply go down through the trapdoor. Beneath the trapdoor was a gigantic plant, something like an enormous Dieffenbachia, with wide leaves emerging from the central stem like a spiral staircase, but darker colored than a normal Dieffenbachia, with tendril-like vines emerging from the central stem and hanging down. The base spread out wide with bigger leaves and tendrils, as though promising to cushion anyone's fall. Beneath was another stone chamber like the first, with the same nooks like false arched windows, emitting the same grey-blue light. The obvious thought is to fly down on the broomstick in my pouch, or toss something heavy to see if those tendrils are traps, Harry said, peering down. But I'm guessing you'll say that we just walked down the leaves. They certainly looked like they were meant to be a spiral staircase. After you, said Professor Quirrell. Harry carefully put a foot down on a leaf and found that it indeed supported his weight. Then Harry took a last look around the room before departing to see if there was anything worth noticing. The enormous dead dog called enough attention to itself that it was hard to focus on anything else. Professor Quirrell, Harry said, omitting the phrase your approach to dealing with obstacles has certain drawbacks. What if somebody looks in the door and sees that the Cerberus is dead? Then they have probably already noticed something wrong with Snape, said Professor Quirrell. But since you insist. The defense professor walked over to the three-headed corpse and placed his wand against it. He began a Latin-sounding incantation that was accompanied by a sense of rising apprehension. The boy, who lived feeling the Dark Lord's power as he always had. The last word spoken was imperious, and it was accompanied by a final surge of stop, don't, and the three-headed dog rose to stand, its 6 eyes dull and blank, turning to watch the door once more. Harry stared at the huge Inferius with a horrible sinking sensation in his stomach, the third worst feeling he'd ever felt in his life. He knew then that he'd seen and sensed this procedure before, only without the spoken Latin. The centaur who confronted him in the Forbidden Forest was dead. The defense professor had hit it with a real Avada Kedavra, not a fake one. Somewhere in the back of his mind, Harry had thought that if he could just get Hermione back, then he could return to the code of nobody dying, the ethic of Batman. Most people went through their whole lives without anyone getting killed on whatever adventures they had. And that was not to be. He hadn't even noticed, the day he lost his last chance to win. Even if Hermione was resurrected, now, Harry wouldn't have come through the whole mess without anyone getting killed. He hadn't even learned the centaur's name. Harry said nothing aloud. The defense professor would either confirm the accusation in Parseltongue or lie in plain speech, and either way the defense professor would have more reason to suspect Harry's next actions. But Harry knew that, although he didn't know how he would stop Professor Quirrell, although he didn't dare any positive act of betrayal, maybe not even making the decision, until it was almost time to win, there would never be an amicable settlement between him and Lord Voldemort, for those two different spirits could not exist in the same world. And it was like that resolution, that knowledge of opposition, invoked a strength from what Harry had thought of as his dark side. Harry had stopped trying to call deliberately on his dark side after the day he'd killed the troll. But his dark side had never been something separate from him. It had been something remembered from Tom Riddle. Harry didn't know how that had happened, but taking the assumption and running with it, whatever echoes of cognitive skill were in his dark side should be there for him to use. Not as a separate mode, as Harry had conceptualized at first, but just as neural patterns with a strong tendency to chain into one another since they had once formed part of a connected whole. This unfortunately did not change that Professor Quirrell had the same skills with far more life experience backing them up, and also had the gun. Harry turned and set foot on the giant plant and began to walk down the spiral staircase provided by the leaves. It had taken Harry too long this time, but he'd recovered himself to some degree, despite the grief still weighing him down like thick water. It wasn't a cold steel rod in his spine, but it was something straight and solid nonetheless. He was going to play this through, see Hermione return to life first, and then, somehow, stop Professor Quirrell, or stop Professor Quirrell first, and then get the stone himself. There had to be something, some possibility, some opportunity that would present itself, some way to stop Voldemort and return Hermione to life. Harry continued his descent. Behind him, the three-headed dog waited, guarding the gate. The next chapter, 107, will post on February 18th, 2015 at *2 p.m. Pacific Time.